is an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Ghostwater, the 5th book in the Cradle series. Chapters 1 and 2 and the prologue. In these chapters, so much happens so quickly that I thought for sure I had read too far. And I just can't believe how balls to the walls this is already. And I have a suspicion I'm really in for it, this book. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Andy for commissioning this episode. I'm super excited to be getting into this book, but I do have to say that personally, I'm a little concerned because I have to go on vacation next week, which means that I can read the next 50 pages, and then I have to wait for a week before I can read anymore. And I think that's going to be terrible. I think I'm going to hate it. It's always hard anyway when I do Spoil Me's because a lot of times commissions are very spaced out. And I got very spoiled with this series because Andy commissioned everything at once. So I'm just getting to read like right on top of each other, which is the best. And I'm having like the one break in there and I can't handle it. This book really just rips its clothes off and goes streaking. Like it's so much so quickly. So the prologue, honestly, the prologue has a very George R.R. Martin sort of feel to it. There's just this thing that he does where he will often begin and end, sometimes only begin books with a prologue that is from a perspective of a character that we have never met before. And almost always the character in that prologue dies. And you're just sort of like waiting for their death and you don't know how they're going to die or what's going to happen. And oftentimes that death is a setup for like a major thing later on. And we meet Mu Enkai. Mu Enkai is just a peon. You know, he's like you and me. He's just somebody who is sort of, he wasn't born to a noble family. He wasn't granted huge amounts of privilege. He isn't super good at any particular sacred art. He's like fine at making fire. And that is what he always did. And then this huge attack happened. And him and all of the other workers, servants, they huddle and wait for the fight to be over. And when they come out, there is an egg. He keeps calling it an egg. Now, I will admit, I figured that when he called it an egg, there was a specific reason for it. But it seems like it was actually just like a piece of the blood shadow. So I thought maybe somehow something going on with like, you know, the attack had caused something to be spawned. And I was almost like, is this like a dragon egg? Because the dragons have died out, but maybe not. Or maybe something has to happen to cause like an egg to appear or I don't know. So I sort of like went with that. And it wasn't until a good way into the prologue that I was like, oh, okay, he's just not, he doesn't know what it is. And that's what he's just calling it for. No better reason than the fact that it's round and it feels like the source of a thing for him. And it says that he had never been somebody who like thought much of himself or aimed very high. And then the egg spoke to him. His reflection was not a servant, not someone who followed a half-remembered, incomplete path that wasn't considered good enough for the sects and schools. He'd seen a king crowned and baptized in blood, and that promise seized something dark in his soul and pulled it forward. When he'd stepped up for the egg, the others had too. He looked to his left and to his right and saw that he was surrounded by thieves. It had been a brief, ugly fight, not a showdown between honorable, sacred artists. The egg had gloried in the blood spilled, and when he stood victorious, he didn't think about his wounds or his fallen friends. The egg was all his. This egg is like the One Ring, but like on crack. It's so much worse because it has this instant effect and you don't even have to have touched it yet. You know, the egg is, it's an instant, you've been wearing the One Ring for 2 years kind of thing. And the idea that like, also I want to mention a half-remembered incomplete path that wasn't considered good enough for the sects and schools. This is something that I find really intriguing. The idea that there are paths out there that people are still following, but that are considered lesser. And why would you follow that path? Is it because those are the like people in your family and they all follow it and you don't have resources to learn a different path? Because there's like this idea I have that at birth everybody's given a book of paths and they get to pick. And I keep forgetting that that's not how that works. You are born into like a clan that follows a certain type of path and you work within that, and usually whatever they know is what you're taught because that's the knowledge that they have to offer. And unless you have access to a library, you know, like the one that Ethan brings Lyndon to, you don't really have lots of choices open to you for the different things that you can do. And that's pretty similar in a lot of ways to the way we function in the real world. Now that we have formal education that is a little bit more accessible to people, and we have so many, like, the world has opened up so much, it's easier to get away from like the family business than it was before, but it is something that I think a lot of people struggle with. If their family has something going on very specifically, not doing the same things that they all did, that can feel like not just frightening because it's unfamiliar, but also it can feel like a betrayal, like you're telling them what they do isn't good enough for you. And as somebody who is engaged to a man who works for a family business, a family-owned business, it is a difficult thing to extricate yourself from. And I think that's interesting because I just forget about how Lyndon's situation, despite the fact that he was treated badly because he was unsold, or so they thought, he still got, like, he knows how to read, you know, and Yaren doesn't, and that has come up a couple of times. There's still levels to everything. And even though Lyndon was in a place where they didn't really know very much about the sacred arts, as it turns out, he still had some privilege, you know, in the way that he was living. And these people are just grinding out here, you know, that sucks. They're basically like factory workers. He'd drawn it inside him without quite knowing how. It nestled inside his soul, even now, warm and safe beside his core, and its power blazed in him like a bonfire. And basically what this does is gives him advancement, like the illusion of it. He can access power from this thing that isn't really his, and the Blood Shadow speaks to him and promises him that it is his, and it's using him, and he doesn't realize because he thinks he's using it, which is so often how this sort of thing works. And he winds up being physically transformed by it. He becomes like, he had been sort of like hunched over, and he begins to stand tall, and he it says, was lean and sharp like a hungry wolf. His gold sign, a shifting flame pattern on the back of his hand that had been stained as red as blood. Honestly, that gold sign sounds kind of boss. Like, some of these gold signs really, that's unfortunate. I really like living with some of them. I'm just like, how do you do it? But that sounds just cool looking. Listen, I just like watching fire. I love to build fires in the fire pit outside. I have a fire screensaver for my computer. I love fire. So having it like on my hand, like a flickering pattern that I could just sit and like stare at and zone out, that's perfect. I like it. So there is this young woman that it seems like he's really directing most of his rage at. She was already a high gold, younger than him, and basically he had to like really beat down on her in order for her to respect him and do what he said. And she veils her spirit around him as he interprets that as a sign of respect. And that is such a beautiful moment to me of like the idea that so many backward people have, that a woman, in order to show respect for a man in a relationship, needs to make herself less and make herself smaller. It's a very literal thing, but I have definitely, like, in the past struggled with that sort of feeling at times. And it's really pervasive. Like, women aren't supposed to be more successful than their male partner if it's a heterosexual relationship. Women are not supposed to wear the pants and be in any way more like aggressive or forceful, not supposed to be smarter. If they are, they're supposed to like sort of be sly about the fact that they're smarter in order to not insult their partner. Just a lot of that. And he has a real problem with this woman. It feels like there was a part of him that maybe had been interested in her at one time, or it's just the idea that she, as a woman at all, was like above him and still sees herself that way despite his ascension. And eventually he starts to get really irritated because they are all, the people around him who are supposed to be sort of waiting on him, are not paying attention to him, and he gets agitated because he wants 100% of their attention at all times. And he really doesn't like the fact that when they begin to pay attention to something else, it's an indicator that they are perceiving something he can't, because they're high golds and he's not. So the egg can only do so much. You know, there are things that it can give him, but it doesn't increase his perception. So there is this illusion that he's higher ranked than he is, that this pierces. Events like this really make it clear he's not at their level, and that enrages him more than anything. And she tells him it's the Skysworn, they must be here to recover the town. And later on, he believes that she has called the Skysworn and that she betrayed him. I don't know how much credence to give that, because I don't really know how that works. I don't know how you call the Skysworn and like alert them something's going on. But he is attempting to sort of cover what's going on and try and like be normal. And this dude shows up, and I gotta tell you guys, I should know by now that when this guy shows up, he's gonna be fucking Lyndon. But he is described in a way that I am not used to still. A man stood outside. First of all, a man. I'm like, oh, word? Broad-shouldered and powerfully built, he loomed over the room, glaring like an executioner about to pass judgment. His right arm was a remnant prosthetic, a skeletally thin limb of white light. Despite his young age, he gave off an oppressive feeling, as though he were deciding which of them to destroy first. I love it. Lyndon is bae. I'm going to say it. I'm interested. Just saying. Andy's in the chat. He says, I love seeing Lyndon from the perspective of his foes. Right? Like, We know what a sweet cinnamon roll he is in so many ways. But the fact that he gives this vibe off, goals. Hashtag goals. I'm telling you guys, we are about to get into some ugly shit in this country, and I can only hope to be this kind of intimidating when it comes down to it, because I have no doubt that there are going to be like physical altercations in my future. And I hope that I can have some of this intimidation factor. So Enkai is genuinely like, oh, fuck. Like, immediately, this dude is here to fuck shit up. He's about to do something to us. And he starts to get really, he gets ready for a fight. And Lyndon handles this in a way that disarms him initially. So Lyndon says, "Pardon, but could you tell me which of you is in charge here?" His voice was apologetic, and he bowed slightly as he spoke. Enkai stopped at the top of the stairs. "I'm happy to represent my master before the Skysworn," he said, and Enkai breathed a little bit more easily. "Your master? Is there a true gold in town?" And this is when Enkai starts to look at him and be like, "This is weird. He's way younger than I thought. He doesn't really seem as intimidating as he appeared to be. And his Madra feels like a child's Madra, and it's not even any stronger than mine. Why was that so scary?" And at first he feels ashamed of himself, and then he gets mad, because that's his reaction every time. He has shame, he has self-doubt, he feels belittled, and then it's followed by rage. And that's just constantly what's going on here. It's just, that is his reaction. So Enkai conjures a ball of fire and says, "I rule here. If the Skysworn need to speak to me, they can come themselves." And Lyndon frames his inquiry as, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We just wanted to know who did such a great job of protecting this town after the attack." And Enkai, this feeds right into his ego, and I have to assume that this is purposeful, and that they know exactly how to talk to people who are in this frame of mind. And he engages in a little bit of conversation. They needed a strong leader. The Skysworn said, "They're alive thanks to you." Radiating sincerity. How did you do it? The honest admiration in the question cracked through Enkai's suspicion. He swelled with pride. It was about time someone asked him that question. And he basically is like, you have to let people know that you're the fucking boss and show them your power. And this woman at this point is frowning up at a corner of the room. And this is when I think he begins to realize that she's expecting more people, so she must have called them. Again, I don't know that because she might just know how the Skysworn work and might be aware that if one of them is there, there will be more, but I don't know. And he says, "I can't wait to see how you will help the next town. In the wake of the crisis, we have more citizens in danger than we have capable leaders." And basically is offering him a position of some authority. Again, I have to assume this is all a farce, but I don't know. Maybe not. And he is, of course, very gratified at the idea of not only being in a position of power, but having control over more people, getting more riches for himself. And this is when he realizes that the real Skysworn were coming, and their servant was just stalling for time. And he begins to throw fire at Lyndon, and it is brutal. He is killing people left and right. And the shooting star kind of technique that he's using is very frightening to me. I'm wondering if that's like a result of the path that he was already on, I have to imagine, because like Yaren's Blood Madra, reacted with a sword, copied her really, but And he burns several people alive, like instantly. And when he looks over at one point, Lyndon tries to calm him down and says, it's telling you what it wants. Let's talk and figure out what you want. And he just says, I'll show you what I want. And he kills like 20 people? 16. My bad. 16 people. And this moment is pretty great to me. It's mine, he shrieked, and even he wasn't sure whether he meant the egg or the town. You don't get... Enkai froze, throat locking up. Something had changed. The stranger stood with his eyes widened in horror, mouth half open as he stared at the blackened holes burned in the village walls. He looked like a man watching his own home burn. But he felt like a monster. His spirit suddenly loomed like the shadow of a dragon flying overhead. Rage replaced by icy dread, Enkai scanned the stranger's spirit. His core still wasn't dense or bright enough to be a high gold. For a moment, Enkai wondered what had changed. Then he realized the man's Madra wasn't pure anymore. His channels were filled with black fire. Darkness flooded into the stranger's eyes like ink, his irises kindling into circles of burning red. That horrifying gaze locked onto Enkai. Why? The sky-sworn servant asked, and the word was a plea. And I just love it. It's so good. Lyndon is just so scary, but also he just is so compassionate and he cares, and it's just the best. And I just love him forever. I just do. That's all there is to it. So, essentially, what it comes down to is fight, 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 throwing fire, and Enkai drains his core entirely dry. Basically to the point that he's like, I may die. I may have permanent damage. Who knows? But fuck you, I'm not going to lose. Like, that's all he cares about, because this thing is focused on its goal and does not give a shit about him. So he pushes forward this technique, but other people are beginning to sort of join in and fuck with him now, because he's being thwarted and they like it. And Lyndon, as he's fighting, like, he almost gets him a couple times. And the way that people are, fucking with him is just part of what keeps Lyndon alive. The dark flame devoured his, melting through an inch at a time. By the time Enkai started to panic, the stranger's power was almost at his chest. You can't, Enkai started to say. Then the bar of black fire burned through his stomach, and the egg was gone. Dark flame spread through him, and he collapsed to the floor like a straw doll. It didn't hurt like he would have expected. It only tingled as though he faded away like a remnant. He had time for one last jealous thought. This stranger had so much power, but he acted like a servant. If Enkai had sacred arts like that and combined them with the egg, he could have ruled the world. Seconds later, Mu Enkai was nothing more than a pile of ashes. Don't start, none won't be none. Sucks to suck. I love especially the constant reminder that Lyndon is becoming terrifying. It's not just his overall appearance. It's not a facade that he's managing to project. He has a power that is, it's very easy for it to be used for negative purposes because of its destructive properties. And reminding us that, like, in the wrong hands, this could be horrifying. I mean, imagine if this guy had been a black flame and he got control of the egg. Forget it. None of these people would be alive. Like, he manages to kill 16 right in a second. I bet he could have done more. And I just like that, because that was how the beginning of Skysworn also began, was Renfei and Bairo flying down to where Lyndon was training and seeing him and being like, what the fuck is up with this dude? And then realizing, and Bairo says somebody is creating a monster. And I think that it's valuable for us to be reminded that, and for it to be proven to us, that's not just those two Skysworn who like know something very specific about the history of the Black Flames or anything. It's not that necessarily. They can just feel what this dude is working with. And they are like, oh my God. And other people have that same reaction who are just meeting him for the first time. So I feel like that's helpful in terms of the perspective, you know? So then we go to chapter 1. And we find out here that it's been a little while. It hasn't been, like, I don't remember the exact amount of time. I feel like they do say at one point. But he hasn't seen Lyndon in all this time. So Yeren. He hasn't seen Yeren in all this time. So he's starting to get worried about her, and he's being a little bit pushy about seeing her. And it turns out she's also concerned about him, but they're being kept apart a little bit. And Renfei, you know, he tries to be like, no, come on, I want to come and see her with you guys. Cause they tell him to stop and stay there when they land on the, what is it? Storm Rock? Is that the name of Storm Rock, the Black City in the Sky. This was Starsweep Tower. That's right. Okay. And also it's mentioned that the destruction from this bleeding phoenix is so widespread and so severe that it's going to be years before things are remotely back to normal. And that is really sobering. You know, it's like it had only risen a couple of days, and that was enough for it to just completely change everything. And we find out later that the Skysworn are going to be recruiting even more people coming up, because they just, you know, they already were letting in a fair number. But now that things have turned to these sorts of situations, they have to spread out and try and... How many of these blood shadows are around? How many people are taken up by them and terrorizing communities, you know? So let's see. Bairo kind of gets in Lyndon's face when he tries to follow anyway. And I really liked this. Bairo has constantly been talked about as huge. A brick wall of a man is the way he's described here. And then we're told that despite how big he is, he's only a couple inches taller than Lyndon. Which, okay, I hadn't realized that, but good for you, Lyndon. And Lyndon basically stares Bairo down after Bairo tells him no. And once he realizes that there's black flame beginning to like activate all over him, he has to take a breath and stop, and is like, oh my God, I almost tried to get in a fight with a fucking Skysworn like superior who's a Trugold in Skysworn headquarters with black flame. Wow, that was going to be a bad fucking call. And he just says, apologies, I have been stressed. And he sinks down into a chair. I apologize for my disrespect, but I am concerned about Yeren. Please, I need to know that she is being treated well. And then we get brought to Yeren. Yeren was being treated like a prize pig hauled in front of a bunch of butchers. What a great description. Because... yeah, she's being like poked and prodded and examined, and there's like a certain amount of fear and respect of what she can do, but not respect for her as like a person at all. And what's going on is basically she has taken into herself a piece of this blood shadow, and they think, might be like in with the enemy, because we just saw what happens when it's not handled well. You know, this dude, like, this is one of those situations where without that context, I might feel a little bit more resentful of the way they're acting, and I still do, but I think it would be worse if I didn't get to see just how bad it can get if somebody manages to, like, hide what's going on. And so they are extremely cautious of her. She figured, let's see, She figured they were making sure she was still herself and not a shell the blood shadow happened to crawl into. She just wasn't sure how they were doing that, and when they didn't know her from how they were doing that when they didn't know her from a bullfrog. Which, I mean, that's a good point. You want to be talking to somebody who's, like, close to her, who knows her, but at the same time, what if they're in on it too? What if this is all a big ploy? You can't trust anybody. They might say whatever they think you want to hear, you know? And they're asking her what color certain cards are, and she asks, like, whether or not that a blood shadow makes you colorblind. And they don't actually answer her. And I am super curious what this is about. Like, I don't know if we're ever going to find out, or if it's just going to be, this was like a ridiculous test these people made. Like, do they think that if you've been taken over by a blood shadow, everything is red? Is that something that we saw when we were in Enkai's perspective? Did he see that, like, the entire world was red? I don't remember. But yeah. This dude, she's, like, getting kind of saucy with the main guy who's questioning her. And eventually she's just like, why don't you just kill me if you really think that this is, you know? And he's like, don't tempt me, Red Moon. And she says, not Red Moon, Aurelius. And he sort of gets red and backs off, because that's a name that means something, and he can't be this way and get away with it if he wants to. If he's, like, going to try and start something, he better be ready to really start something, and he knows it. So Biro comes in and asks if she's clear, and the main dude says, like, well, she's going to turn on us before the sun sets. And Biro's like, well, I guess I'll use her for as long as I can before the sun sets. And they finally let her free. She's been in half silver, like, handcuffs this entire time. And as she's walking past, it's before she's even released, people are, like, looking at her with this, like, attitude that they're going to try and threaten her, or it's just the sort of thing that to her is incredibly spineless, because she's literally handicapped at the moment, and they are still acting as if she's going to come at them, you know? And between her and Linden, we've got two people with these abilities that are extremely powerful, but also reviled and stigmatized in a certain way. Justifiably or not, I don't know, but they are, you know. And I would say for Yaren justifiably. For Linden, I am guessing so, but I haven't really seen evidence or examples of what everybody has talked about. And finally, Biro says the Black Flame completed his mission. We will speak to you both, and that's all you need to know. And she says, oh, really? Last I checked, there's 3 of us. What about the new girl? And he kind of gets a look on his face like he's annoyed, and she's very happy about that. And he says she's coming too. And I feel as if we're going thematically, there has to be something going on with Mercy that is going to turn out to be similarly stigmatized or problematic. And we just don't know what it is yet. The fact that she's always stumbling is of particular interest, because that could be so many things. It could be the fact, like, for all I know, she's got like an extra leg or a tail. I don't really know what she's wearing most of the time. I feel like she's wearing robes a lot, which could potentially like hide an extra appendage, or, you know, she's a gold, right? So the gold sign, I think, is meant to be this like tar-like thing on her hands, but it's also on the staff she's using. And there's no reason to believe it couldn't manifest as another thing on her body. Or there could be something like in her sight that is causing her to, like, she sees things and it sort of throws her off balance. Or maybe there's like some sort of vertigo associated with something that she can do. Maybe she suffered a really bad injury and never quite recovered the way she was meant to. But all of this is just making me wonder what exactly it is that caused her family to reject her the way they did, because they've made it really clear they don't care if she lives or dies. And I have to assume their feelings on that are linked to the stumbling. And I have no idea if that's true. I'm just making that connection because this whole culture is based on people respecting strength more than anything. And the stumbling seems to be an indicator of weakness. And I feel like that has to be part of their problem with her, is that she doesn't come across as strong as they want her to. But I don't know. This is all just kind of throwing things at the wall, you know. So then we go to Renfei. And it says she stood in front of the room where she left Ahkura Mercy to recover. It swung open soundlessly, revealing a mass of darkness so thick it was almost palpable. If she stuck her hand past the door frame, it looked as though it would be swallowed by endless night. Only one thing was visible in the inky murk, a bright purple book hovering in the center of the room. It glowed, but somehow cast no light. Only the book itself was visible, a single distinct figure in an ocean of black. The book was spread open, its pages thick, and it pressed on her spirit with an impression of overpowering might and incomprehensible age. Then it vanished, and Mercy hopped out of the dark. And I love this moment. Renfei is waiting for Mercy to show her true self. And everybody seems to think, because of the fact that she's from the Ahkura family, and because of how incredibly friendly she's been, that she must be lying. She must be putting on a bit of a show. And I love this so much. She is thinking about like the way that the aura works for what Mercy's doing, the way that she's cycling. She says, "It's not my favorite aura to cycle, hard not to fall asleep." It was deep shadow aura in there, laced with some other darker aspects that dissipated even as Renfei tried to sense them. It was a tapestry of black. Some of the rumors about Ahkura paths flashed through her mind, and she could feel her expression harden. This was a fine nest of vipers she had been told to babysit. So this is the moment when she's like, Renfei felt an instant of what she could only call a premonition. She was about to see beyond the mask of the cheery, innocent girl. And what Mercy does is touch her arm and say, "You must be exhausted." And she's dead serious. Like, Renfei can tell that. She's looking at her, trying to see if she's being sarcastic, if she's trying to be a bit of a snot. No, she's genuinely like, "Oh, sweetie, are you okay?" And Renfei is just like, "You know what? Don't worry about me." But she does wind up talking a little bit about the fact that they have not had time to sleep. And pretty quickly, they get into a conversation that gets sort of cut off, which gives me the impression that she gets chattier with Mercy than she intended to or expected to. So Lyndon, he's waiting in that room, and Mercy is brought in, and he is about to get up, and he realizes that it's not Yaren, and he's just like, "Oh, whatever," and sits back down again, even though it's like not really polite. And Lyndon keeps noticing that Renfei is just treating Mercy a little bit differently, and he's assuming that it's because she's a member of the Akura clan. And then he's like, I don't know, maybe it's like that she's like a little sister, like what's going on over there? So I should mention that Lyndon doesn't exactly have any better of a grasp on Mercy as a person than Renfei does. He is approaching her just as cautiously. He doesn't seem to think that she's like exactly lying about who she is, but he keeps, I think it's who she is like family-wise, that he is expecting her to have a certain like attitude due to that. And because, I mean, he's so used to being at the bottom of the pecking order that the fact that she is very polite to him is constantly a little bit surprising. So at this point, Yeren comes in, and they start to like talk to each other, and Renfei keeps on being like, "You can't talk. Stop it. You're waiting for an assignment. Don't speak." And I'm just like, oh my God, you guys are such downers. So finally, Bairo comes in, and it's time to get down to business. And Renfei says, all right, you guys all know why you're put together. And I wouldn't have put you on the same team if the captain hadn't ordered it. Even so, we never intended to give you assignments. Keeping you out of the public eye and under our supervision would have been enough. Now the situation has changed. We're going to use every asset we can lay our hands on, and if it turns out we can't use you, we'll throw you out. And Yeren, to be fair, says, seems to me you've tried that already. And I love the fact that she fucking just says that shit. I just love Yeren so much. She's just great. She always has some shit to say, and she just does not give a fuck. So Yeren says this, and Renfei's response is to like produce this sort of wall-like Madra, and it's interesting. It's called Cloudhammer Madra, and it causes Yeren to indeed shut her mouth. And I'm so saddened at what happens at the end of the next chapter, because we aren't going to get to see her use that again, and I'm really curious about it. So she says, we will put you to use for the Empire, or we'll throw you in a cell at best. And she says about how they have to be kept isolated from the rest of the public. And I'll be brief because we have a cloud ship to catch on the hour. We're headed for a 3-day journey into the trackless sea. It will be cramped and uncomfortable. I expect you to silently cycle the entire way unless you need to fight. Our destination is a pocket world called Ghostwater, created by the monarch Northstrider. Lyndon asks what a pocket world is, and she says, it means a pocket-sized world, a self-contained space much smaller than our own, but separate, exactly like it sounds. Look, I get that, but what is it? I want to know how that can be possible. It's one thing to have, abilities that can create things out of Madra and siphon power and make you stronger or faster. It's another thing to be able to access other dimensions. That's a whole nother thing. So I would like to know, but maybe we'll get there. I don't know. Maybe we'll see somebody that we know create a pocket dimension. So she says the battle between the Akura Matriarch and the Dread God has damaged the anchor binding that world to our own. If our experts are correct, it will crumble within the next few months. We were alerted to the current problem by this artifact, the Eye of the Deep. And she pulls out this stone that is on the cover, and it's really cool looking. It was left to the last emperor in the Black Flame family for safekeeping by one of the monarch's heralds. It grants access to main facilities of Ghostwater. I will carry this and guide us around, so stick with me. Without this, you will die alone as space itself crumbles around you. I want to know what exactly the deal is with ghost water and why they even care that it's breaking down. I guess they think that there might be treasures inside because she says something about like, we'll secure as many treasures as possible and report back. But this is like the fact that they give a shit, I find curious. I feel like there has to be more to this. So they ask whether anybody's living inside and whether they need to worry about a fight. And they said there might be scavengers inside. So, and she also tells Lyndon to bring Orthos with him because they're going to need everybody. So we cut to the flight to the island, and they're kind of trying to guess what the pocket world could be like. Mercy is talking to Lyndon and Yaren, and they're being very guarded. Apparently Mercy still hasn't been like let in on the whole thing with Ethan and that marble that was left to him. So they can't talk about it freely in front of her. And yet I get the sense that they like kind of want to trust her. I mean, she's part of this team in her way now. You like to be able to just be able to speak with everybody frankly, you know? So it says it was larger than Lyndon had imagined from the sketch in the air, big enough that from their vantage point, this is the island, hovering just above the trees, he couldn't see the opposite shore. It was heavily forested except for the beaches, with one prominent hill in the center doing a decent impression of a mountain. And he's noticing that Orthos isn't doing super well, and he's about to pull out the river seed in order to help him out, and they get interrupted, and he stops and doesn't do it, which is going to be, I think, pretty significant later. So there's this door, and Renfei clearly doesn't expect the door to be open. It's not, the situation is different. And so she and Biro kind of go off to the side and chit chat about what to do. And Lyndon is watching what's happening, and he immediately is like, oh, they're going to separate us. One group goes through to scout, the other stays out here until the first reports back. They'll divide us so that each of them can handle a group on their own. And sure enough, that is exactly what they do. So Lyndon gets chosen to go in with Renfei. And also, of course, Orthos. And they go in, and it's this wild underwater bubble, basically. He says that it's like the size of a castle, I think, is the way that he describes it. Which castles are so vastly different in size that doesn't really help me in terms of like imagining the situation. But it's as good as you can do once you start dealing in sizes like that. And he's walking on like a sandy ocean floor, and the bubble around him is just this like sort of tension spell scripted, keeping the water away. And there's like crabs crawling around, seashells. It's pretty wild sounding. It's really cool. And there is like a tree that's like phosphorescent in the middle that's setting off this glow and keeping everything lit. And it says a sense of awe hung heavy over the place, like Lyndon had trespassed on an ancient tomb. Invisible pressure pushed on him as though he'd shouldered the entire weight of the ocean above. It was only a moment before he realized that the pressure wasn't his imagination. By then he'd noticed that Renfei had stopped, one hand on her hammer, her cycling Madra drawing wisps of dark cloud around her armor. Orthos growled so low and loud that the sand shook. They weren't alone. And there is this dude who's sitting and cycling. His features so delicate that at first Lyndon mistook him for a woman. A disk of shadow hovered behind his head like a dark halo, which sounds pretty dope. And then he notices the other three. I think there are three. Said there are two servants that I believe are just made of Madra. There is the dragon woman, who I keep picturing Vajra from Doctor Who just covered the Snowman episode. So she is very much in mind here. And she sees them and smiles at them and immediately has like this drop of gold Madra that she manifests, and Lyndon interprets that immediately as a threat and begins to cycle Black Flame. And then, let's see, his attention was drawn by a deadlier threat, a flash of red from the left, far away from both the cycling man and the dragon woman. He recognized that sensation in his spirit. He recognized that color. A young woman stepped up, blood shadow covering her like a cloak. Her hair fell into her eyes, shrouding her expression, but blood Madra trickled away from her feet, steadily spreading across the sand. Ooh, that sounds actually really, really cool. And then he notices that there is this little hut to the right that looks like it's been like kind of just put together from whatever somebody could find. And there is a young man there, pulled himself out of the hut's doorway like a corpse crawling from a grave. His eyes were bloodshot and half-lidded, his gray cloak stained and dirty. 2 emerald horns rose from his forehead, pointing up. And Lyndon tries to feel the guy's like spirit to see what his deal is, and says he hurriedly pulled it back. The man seemed not to notice, but his aura felt as strong and steady as the roots of a mountain. So this is a really weird hodgepodge, and it becomes apparent pretty quickly once things begin to pop off. These people aren't exactly friends with each other. I kind of thought that they had come here together, and there's not really any evidence of that. They could have all just, heard about what was going on here, wanted to plunder the place, and each arrived separately. It seems like that's the deal. And Renfei, meanwhile, is sending a notification back to Bairo to not follow multiple enemies. We will try to disengage, maintain your position, and call for reinforcements. And she explains to them, Renfei does, what they're doing here, and tries to stay calm. But Lyndon's like, ooh, yeah, but she's super, super not calm at all, though. And he's also super aware that he is the lowest level there. Everybody here, if they get in a fight, he's going to be so outclassed, and he just doesn't really feel like he could bring anything to the fucking table. So Orthos, for his part, he's just feeling really like cranky. And so he starts like the man's perception moved over to their group, slow and careless. He dismissed Lyndon in a blink, but his spirit lay heavy on Orthos and Renfei. Who is backing you? The Winter Sage? Orthos snarled. We need not answer to you. And the dragon girl's like, oh, by the way, when you're done with them, let me have their stuff. And the greenhorn man, interestingly, says not every fight needs to be to the death, dragon. What could they possibly have on them? And the Red Moon Hall girl says they shouldn't be here. They are not bound by the rules. Who can know who sent them? What's that mean? What rules? Like, it feels like there's something that these people have in common, but they don't really seem to be allies. It's just a weird vibe. I don't really know what their deal is. So Renfei tries to send Lyndon back. And as he turns to run, a tendril of blood comes up from the floor and comes at him. It says, poised in front of him like a snake coiled to strike. And the young woman says, yeah, you're going to wait a second. while we get our instructions. The golden dragon says, no need to bother your sage with this. I'm assuming the sage is the dude who's cycling, and he is a blood sage. Is that what they would be called? Because this thing that happens here is so scary. I was making dinner, listening to the audiobook, and I got to this part, and I gasped out loud. I really did. And Owen was like off, like in another room, and he heard me and he came in. He was like, "Are you okay?" And I like had to pause it and be like, somebody just got sliced down the middle, and it was somebody that I thought was going to be kind of an ongoing character. And the fact that they've been killed really suddenly is just, I was just wildly unprepared for how real this was going to get. I expected out of Renfei and Bairo that Bairo would be the one to die. It's just, when you have supporting characters, and you've got supporting characters who are paired off, and one of them is a taciturn dickhead who rarely speaks, and the other is just a very duty-bound but fair-minded person, you expect the taciturn one to be the one that's killed. You just think that the author's going to want to keep around the one who's a little bit friendlier and more willing to talk to other characters, because that's easier to work with as an author. And so I had, I think, a low-level like assumption that Bairo was going to be taken out of the picture. Now, that may still happen. There's no reason only one of them has to die. But I just never thought Renfei was on the table at all. I really thought that she was being made a serious part of the situation, and even potentially could be someone that they won over once they got a little bit farther along, who like became a part of their crew in a way. So this, I'm just going to read this. She starts to try and like make this speech, and talks about how, you know, they'll be given things that will be much more valuable than what they could be mugged for, essentially. The world went silent as the young man on the boulder opened his eyes. Like Mercy's, they shimmered like a deep amethyst. Shadow flashed out from the seated man as though it had been unleashed, dimming all light. His right hand drifted up, then down, like a painter leisurely adding a stroke to canvas. "Silence," he said, as his hand lowered. In a blink, so that Linden thought he'd imagined it, a thin line of shadow flickered down, passing through the middle of Renfei's body from the top of her head down. The Akura representative closed his eyes. Renfei fell apart. Her armor was still untouched, but her body collapsed in a pile of blood. Linden stared, too stunned to be horrified, and before he could avert his eyes, the blood shadow covered Renfei's corpse. An instant later, a towering giant of black clouds slid out of the shadow with an explosion of force that sent both Linden and Orthos tumbling away from the portal. The remnant punched two fists of dark fog together with explosions that cracked like thunder, launching itself forward. Which honestly sounds pretty rad. So the fact that the dragon girl laughs really was rude to me. I did not like that at all. She sends a wrist-thick river of golden liquid punching through the spirit, but Linden didn't have time to watch. The blood shadow was reforming, gathering itself up to engulf him. A massive boulder plunged from above, slamming into the sand, cutting off the blood shadow and shielding Linden. So the green-horned man protects him. And he calls the dragon girl Yan Shumei, I think is how you would say that, and tells her that he is not your opponent, and they begin to fight. So Linden is like, okay, we need to get the fuck out of here. And he's looking for the way out, and there's a moment where he notices that despite the fact that she's just been cut in half, Renfei's armor is still fine, and he kind of wants to grab it, but there's just no time and there's just no way. So he grabs the stone, that sapphire that she's been carrying, and it's cracked, we find out. And I don't know what that means, but it's damaged. And he's looking for the doorway, and he finally sees it. And he can see Mercy attempting... Oh, I forgot that the Akura man says, I asked for silence again. And he uses this fucking shadow thing yet again. Kills Renfei's remnant. The dragon girl, almost gets sliced by it. It says, the horned man raised a hand and a circle of green script flashed into existence in front of him. The edge of shadow cut into it and the script flickered at the contact before shattering like glass. And his hand splits open, but he doesn't get completely cut. And I think that's kind of like interesting. It's like the shield did something. It cracked, it broke, so obviously can't be used again, but at least for the once, it managed to save his life. And then Orthos gets cut, which the fact that his shell gets split open, again, just so rude. Like, that is supposed to be so hard to do as to kind of be a pointless thing to even try. And this dude did it with just like barely even a glance. And I find that very upsetting. And Lyndon just taps into the Black Flame core and decides that everything that he's going to do is going to be getting Orthos to the portal and out. And I think it's really kind of funny. He's got like this strength to him, but it comes in bursts. So he can't just like push against Orthos and just like get them out of there. He has to like shove Orthos in these spurts, which is so impractical and just frustrating. And this is when he looks up and he sees Byro was holding Mercy back with one armored hand, dragging her away from the portal. He was clearly trying to retreat. And a handful of yellow Madra droplets blasted out of his other hand, striking at Yaren, who was darting for the gateway. And there's this beautiful moment in which Lyndon knows absolutely that she's coming for him. And I highlighted this line. She was headed into the hands of these True Golds, and she didn't even know it. But if she did know, she would only run faster. Yaren forever. 'Cause it's true. Would that we could all have a friend like Yaren who is ready to fuck some shit up, and the scarier the opponent, the more ready she is. I love her so much. And I love that Lyndon is just, his instinct is, no, you are not going to do this. I'm not going to let you get hurt. And he gets rid of the portal and is basically like left here in this fishbowl with these terrifying monster people with no way to get out. Like, he can get past the water, like, but I assume that he would be crushed. He doesn't entirely do it. He seems to take it for granted that they could just go out one of these walls, and maybe they can. I don't know, but I wouldn't count on it. And this book is called Ghostwater, and that's the name of this place. Are we just going to hang out here for the whole book? Is he going to be separated from Yaren for the... I hope not. I can't handle that, the two of them. No, I don't like it. I am out of time, but suffice to say, the dragon girl is coming at him and trying to take his stuff, which is pretty fun. I think the theme with her is the gold and wanting stuff like a dragon with a hoard, right? So I really enjoy that. I think that's kind of neat. And she tells him, if you give me something worthwhile, I might not even kill you. And this is when Orthos starts to get really worked up. And finally, the two of them begin to go at it. I am here for Orthos fighting. I wish that Lyndon didn't have so much else to do so that he could just see what was going on here, because I'm so curious. It's the two of them are just, there's this weird relationship because of the dragon thing. And she says that, what does she call him? Black dragons, little better than dogs. Which, is that racist? Is that what's going on there? And he's using the 1,000-mile cloud that he was given by the Skysworn to find a way out. And this attack that she's making hits the cloud and it just dissipates. And he manages to not die when he hits the ground, but he hits hard. His bag is cut open and the case for Little Blue is busted. And he manages to find her, but it takes a second. And I don't know what it means if she doesn't have a habitat to live in. I really have no idea. But it says, holding Little Blue on his shoulder, he dashed over to the box he discarded. He shoved everything in that had survived into it. The leather roll that contained his soulsmith tools, the polished wooden case holding his badge collection, the notes on Hunger Madra, his Heart of Twin Stars manual. The Eye of the Deep went inside too, but it must have taken a hit. The jewel had a single long crack down one side. So he grabs Orthos, and Orthos is still trying to fight, and he's like, no, come on. And he yells, run. Then he ran through the bubble. Black, icy water swallowed him, and that's where it ends. Which just... And I had to stop, you guys. I had to stop there. Ugh, I am disgusted. So, I really have to go because I'm so over time. But thank you, Andy, for commissioning this. But I do hate you. And I will be seeing you guys next week with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.